Unlike Brent,
to chat about
unlike Brent, I need some props to pull mine off.
giving IT a run for his money.
Yeah, I wish Eric Ries and Brant had written their books, and I had read those before. I literally probably burned through $150 million of other people's money, literally making mistakes that I could have not made, doing it the old-fashioned way he described. And so I learned all that stuff the hard way. Brant's books and Eric Ries's books, The Lean Startup, Lean Entrepreneur, those, they've created a really nice, easy on-ramp and a vernacular and a metaphors and things that make some of these hard lessons easier to learn. And it's good stuff. So save yourself and your investors $150 million and just read the book. It's much cheaper. So I'm going to tell my story about applying lean to hardware. In fact, I finally learned all these lessons after being an entrepreneur for 15, 20 years. The book came out about the time I was doing these experiments, but sort of validated finally the stuff that I had learned. So I'm going to talk about how you apply lean startup to hardware, which can be a different challenge than to software. And I'll talk about how I did it through the lens of my experience at EcoATM and that company. How many people have heard of EcoATM? You don't have them here yet, but we're trialing in Europe. And the trials went really well, so they're probably going to move here. I'm no longer with the company. I sold it, stayed around for a couple of years and left recently, but I still know the story. So how do you create something from nothing and then build that and build value and know that it has value before you go spend not $150 million, but your hard-earned time and money and maybe Aunt Martha's and a bunch of other people and the people you hire and bring into it. And wouldn't it be nice to know if you were going to fail early and not have to go through all that pain and suffering? Because being an entrepreneur is hard. So how do you know if it's going to be valuable? Let's find that out and fail quickly instead of and move on to the next thing. Anybody in here building hardware as a startup? All right, so you probably won't like this pitch at all, but. So Eric Ries has this quote: "The only way to learn, or only way to win, is to learn faster than anyone else." And that's sort of the crux of it, right? Learn fast. The founder of LinkedIn, Reid Hoffman, has another one that says, if you're not embarrassed by your first product release, you've launched too late. But these concepts for good entrepreneurs have been around for a while for the few that actually got them. This is a quote from the founding, and I think this was in the 20s or 30s. This is probably the most prolific hardware company there is, IBM, founding CEO. The way to succeed is to double your error rate, right? Find the errors quicker, and that makes you smarter faster than everybody else. It seems counterintuitive, but you want to find what's wrong with it quickly before you blow a bunch of money. And then this guy was a lean startup guy. I love Mark Twain. He said, "The man who carries a cat by the tail can learn something that he can learn no other way." So you really have to get to the customer and grab that tail to really know what's going on. So maybe he was the first lean startup guy. I never heard the Mechanical Turk story, and I have to say, it was a serious conversation for maybe 3 minutes at one point in our early life at EcoATM that we would hire, what's the politically correct term? Little people. We would hire, and we actually looked at it. It was expensive. You can hire, but so EcoATM, let me tell you about that, so I'll give you some context. EcoATM is a self-serve consumer kiosk that would sit in retail where you go at a mall or grocery store or the pharmacy, and it's in your sort of weekly or monthly path, and it automates the inspection, valuation, and buyback of your old electronics, mostly phones, but you would walk up with your last phone, put it in, the cameras look at it, we use some artificial intelligence, machine vision, have a robotic thing that presents the right cable for that phone. It does an electrical inspection, and then 3 minutes, it presents a price. If you like the price, it pays you cash on the spot, and it bends it inside, and then we make our money selling those in the secondary market. So, most smartphones are still worth 100, 200 bucks after you're finished, after a couple of years. And there's this huge insatiable market for those worldwide. The trick was, how do we get consumers to participate in that process of selling them? Online mousetraps trying to catch those phones. They were moderately successful. There was charity boxes and so forth, but most people just took them and stuck them in the drawer because it's easy and because it's got your data on it, and it's because who wants this old phone? And so the average household in the US when we started had 7 used mobile phones sitting somewhere, and nobody was recycling them. And I read this survey in a coffee shop in 2008 that Nokia did, 13 countries, 6,500 households, and they basically, the result of the survey is only 3% of people had ever recycled a cell phone. There's 1 billion cell phones sold that year. Like, what's happened to the other 990, whatever the math is, million? So what can we do about that? How do you get people to participate in this problem that everybody has in the solution? So our assumptions, which we went out to validate, were that if you made it in their normal path, if you paid them cash, people like money, and if you made it quick, and convenient, and immediate, that we could get people to participate in mass. So those are big assumptions, right? And you got to go validate that. This is a really capital-intensive business. Ultimately, we raised about 80 million bucks. The first automated unit that we didn't have people standing next to that really worked took $13 million to get there. It's a hard task to go out and say, hey, VCs, I have no proof of this idea will work, but I need $13 million to build the first one. And then even harder than just getting the money to do that would be, how do you know what to build? How do you know what consumers will respond to? Not the technology, but the other stuff. So the way we went about it, so EcoATM, 2008 it started, sold a couple of years ago, a whole bunch of IP, a bunch of jobs created. We have kiosks in almost every state, and they're looking at Europe. And it worked, and it worked really well, but we discovered that through a bunch of hard work, which I'll show you. So here, sorry, I'm skipping around here, but the inspiration was, you do have Coinstar machines, at least in the UK. And the recycling machines and automated checkout, and people like automation. They particularly like automation if it's something they don't want to deal with another human about. And it turns out establishing the price, the value of this used cell phone, or a used car, or a used anything, it's uncomfortable for a US market. And I think a lot of, some places in the world that like to negotiate, but this particular problem is not something that humans want to deal with another human on. So, and there was a bunch of technology built. So how do we do it? How do you go from the Starbucks to experimenting to success and do that efficiently without, burning a bunch of money and time? So this is our first MVP, minimal viable product. This is Old Bessie. This was our proof of concept. There was only one of her ever built. She's beautiful, but all she is wood and empty inside, and she has a touchscreen on the outside that we programmed, and it was a simple interface. It said, what's your brand? Apple, brought up a picture of all the iPhones. Actually, there's only a couple of them at that time. Click on your model, and then answer some questions. Is it broken? Does it power up? So forth, and then it yielded a price. It wasn't even connected to the internet. And it wasn't connected, there was no technology other than that. So here's Old Bessie being built, and we loaded that thing up, put it in the back of my truck, and we drove it to the first place that would let us try it, which was in Omaha, Nebraska. And they picked us, but we really liked that pick because they only have 3 stores. They're not a national retailer. It was a big, giant retail location. But if we screwed up there, it probably wouldn't be destructive testing our entire customer base. If I trialed with Walmart, which ended up being a big customer for us. And I screwed it up. I never get to go back to Walmart. But here I could test and do destructive testing if I failed. But as it turned out, here's the first folks that touched the machine about 10 minutes into our putting it down. Here's our first customer. This lady saw it, and she said, "That's wonderful. I have 7 phones in my drawer at home." She went, turned on her heel, walked out to the parking lot, got in her truck. She lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is 30 miles away. She drove, got her phones and her granddaughter, and brought them back. They were all worthless phones, by the way. There's some phones we can only pay $1 for the recycle value of the materials. She probably burned $40 in gas or more getting to Lincoln and back. And she does, and I'm so worried she's gonna have a bad experience. And she gets her $7. And she was just so excited. This is, and we, so, why are you excited? I've had this problem from Era. I didn't know what to do with it. She's down $35, but she's happy as she can be. So that was one insight. People just want to get rid of the problem, right? Within a couple of days, we had lines forming. And this is all organic, no advertising, no nothing. Within a week, we had a perpetual 45-minute waiting line, and at 9 in the morning when the store opened, there would be a crowd of people. The manager had never seen it. He walked up, first day they're standing there, he opens it, and they all rush back to our machine. That same guy, we only had a 30-day trial. At the end of it, he was hugging the machine as I was trying to take it out. You can't take it, you can't take it. So I had 2 customers in this that I was testing. I had the end consumer, but I also had the retailer, right? Because I have no place to host my machines if I don't have a value proposition for them. So we were testing both customers at the same time. And even though there was no technology in this thing, turns out we were very accurately, very precisely testing the consumer response to how many people walking through retail would see a machine that looked like it would buy back your phones automatically and turn on nobody has their used phones with them. They got to go home and come back. How many people will do that, right? That's a big assumption. So it turns out a whole bunch. And but a couple of big things that we learned from that first 30 days. One was people were happy even if they didn't make a ton of money. The other was that they didn't like dealing with other humans. So when we first set the machine down, we stood there for about 10 minutes and people were coming through and they saw you standing next to it and they'd make a big arc around you. They didn't want to talk to you. They avert their eyes. There's all this psychology that happens in nanoseconds for a consumer going through retail with all this stuff screaming at them. So there's no way to know that in advance. You have to test that in real life. And so we noticed that people are arcing around us. So we started to lurk down the aisle, right? We would stay away from the machine and we would wait till they engaged and they were touching the buttons and halfway through, and then we would spring on them from behind and then if they were gonna sell, then there was no technology, we would, look at what they had said, quickly evaluate this is an iPhone, not a banana or a rock or something. And so we were the technology, but the observer's paradox, which is by observing the experiment, you change the experiment, right? There's always and it's harder on hardware, that notion of software, it's a little easier in some cases because it goes out and you're not there and they're gonna use it and you can measure that. Hardware could be challenging because, first of all, it's hard to distribute a bunch of big iron hardware to a bunch of people. And second, the observer's paradox, particularly in our case. So we had to minimize that paradox. And I think we did a good job for the piece we were testing, but again, we're not testing technology. So anyway, we went 30 days and then press started showing up because of these lines, and that was great. So then we were having to empty the machine twice a day. It would fill up and start spilling out on the floor. These are the phones just from the last 2 days of that experiment. It was pretty wild. So here we think we got this great thing and we're gonna go do this, but I have no technology, and I know it works at one store. So then we did all that for $20K. We had burned probably 200 at that point, not including me not taking a salary during that time. But so then we got the courage and a little bit more money and said, let's figure out how to do more of that in different venues. So let's build 20 similar machines, but let's make a chassis where we can start to test the technology piece, because it's not trivial. So we built this in all of these also, some of these were out for 2 years. We also had staff standing next to it. I ran out of my own people and I got tired of standing there all day because I got other stuff to do. So we ended up hiring, at one point we had about 150 temps that took 4-hour, 8-hour shifts at these machines and did the same thing that we taught them to do, lurk down the aisle and then spring on people when they were unsuspecting. So we built 20 of those. And started trying different ways to present the cables, different machine vision, different lighting, working that out. So we called her Jenny, and here's some examples of that rollout. We tried it at a lot of college campuses, Walmarts, malls, and so forth. And again, the crowd showed up. Same thing. So we repeated this experiment. It worked again, and so we got pretty confident at that point. Now we just have to make the technology solid, because I can't scale if I got to put 4 people beside this thing taking shifts all day, even though we were actually making money. By the way, we were generating a bunch of revenue at this point too. Some of these machines were doing $500,000 a year in revenue at about 60% margin. I hope that 60% margin doesn't ruin your experience if it does come to Europe. But that's, people would pay. We did the elasticity test and they really weren't so sensitive about the price. So this took us about $500K to build all of those, and we burned about $3 million to that point. Again, very efficiently getting to those big milestones and proof points. Finally, we launched, the generation 3. We were able, with the proof points of those first 21 machines in 2 years of testing, to raise money to build this at a pretty good valuation. And once we took the people away, it actually even worked as good or better than it did in the beginning, not to mention the cost savings. So that first unit, again, cost $13 million to get to, but we had not only learned how and why and what to build and why people used it, but we had vetted the technology as well and done that in the field with real customers. And there's some examples of that. There's our production line in San Diego. Eco ATM's collected over 8 million phones at this point. Recycled those. Most of those would have ended up in landfill as toxic waste. About 4 million customers, and we've paid out over $200 million. It's better numbers than though, but I don't work there anymore, so I can't say the real numbers, but they're better than this. So in summary, the lean methodology can be effective on big iron hardware, but you have to be clever about doing it. I'm working on another startup right now, which is in stealth, and I would love to talk about it. I can't. What I can say is it's another kiosk, but it's in the healthcare space. And I would, really tempted to sort of follow the model I did on this one, but I can't because it's its own unique thing. We have the FDA to get through, and some other things that complicate it. So I can't do this. So instead, I'm having to try a different path, which is we're actually mimicking a pharmacy. And the people that, we get subjects in this consumer research, and we screen those and bring people in so they know it's a test, but we have to mimic this instead of do it and sort of accomplish the things that we did here, but in a so the observer paradox is much higher, much worse in that situation, but I don't have the option. So you have to be clever about how you do it. The way I did this won't apply to every piece of hardware, right? You can't do it. But there's usually a way to figure out how to do this. So it saves significant time and money. And look, if you want to be an entrepreneur, find out if this idea fails and move on to a better one as quick as you can. Don't just stick on it. Be prepared to move to something else. Testing multiple constituencies. Again, in our case, we got 2 for 1 there in our test. And then, like I talked about destructive testing, if you have one customer in the world and if you fail the first time, then, that may not be the best way to go test that. So destructive testing on hardware, on a small constituency, you got to be sensitive and figure that out. So we didn't start with Walmart, we started with a 3-site retailer. Anyway, I'll stop there, and if there's any time for Q&A, take some questions. Any questions? I must have cleared it all up. That's about right. I think it's a little higher than that. We,
Question there, Mark.
yeah.
Are they looking at going with another vertical in terms of recycling, upcycling?
That's a sore subject. I filed a whole bunch of patents and built a bunch of technology to do that. And to move into bigger things, particularly PCs, laptops, because there's a big secondary market for that stuff as well. TVs don't retain their value in the secondary market, but PCs and laptops is a big category. Filed a bunch of patents, got that technology working, and it's not been rolled out yet. I would have done it if I was still there and in charge, because I think it is another degree of freedom and revenue, but they haven't done that yet, so, yeah. Yes?
I'm curious whether you did any traditional market research beforehand. Like,
Yeah.
did you actually try to glean any of this stuff from surveys?
Yeah, I did, and it was, the beauty of that story reinforces my story is I did these surveys, and I probably did a poor job in the discipline that you should have in that, but I did a bunch of survey monkeys, but where I screwed up is I used my 5,000 email list, which was mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males from Silicon Valley for, the test that never went into a grocery store, most of them. So, but I did that, and a couple of interesting things. It's totally off of what reality was. For example, when I asked the question, I described this potential system that they would find in the store, and how would you view that? But how many people, we had a charity option, so you could give all your money to charity, which, by the way, nobody chose. Less than 0.1%. We forced you through the charity option. Give part, all, $1, we tried everything. And unfortunately, once you're presented in that moment with hard cash or charity, nobody makes that choice. So, but anyway, in the survey before that, of my 5,000 white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male engineer friends, 36% of them said, yeah, they'd use it, but only for charity. And then the other 36% said they would use it, another 36% said they would use it, but only because of the environmental thing, they didn't care about the money. And I can tell you firsthand, because I stood next to this kiosk for thousands of transactions at a time, the environmental motivation for people being there was secondary by a mile. They wanted their money. And you had to have the environmental story as a secondary thing. And they all wanted to, were interested in it. But I joke about this, but I think this is true. If I actually brought up a screen that right before you got yes, I want my money, if I said, you should know before you press yes, that we take all of the old phones and we melt them down into the shape of clubs, and we club baby seals with them. I think we would still have 99.5% of our revenue. Well, too bad about the seals, and they'd take their money. Again, the surveys wouldn't have told you that, but that's the truth. So anyway, yes. Yeah, so that's a really long discussion. I could do 2 hours on it. I was tortured by that, but we from the beginning, we made a couple of other assumptions that were really big that I didn't cover. One is that we didn't want any stolen phones, and the bad guys would, try to use this. So every phone that we've ever collected, I forced you, and this is one of the things we had to test in Europe, because Europeans are a little more sensitive than people in the U.S., but I force you to give me your driver's license, and I scan it. And then I go to a database. I have technology that knows the watermarks and can tell if it's fake. And then I not only scan that, I've got 3 cameras that take a picture of you from all sides. I take your thumbprint, and I have a camera that makes sure it's that you putting your thumbprint. And I've got a building full of people back in San Diego right now that actually look at every transaction and compare your photo to you and your thumbprint and all of that by a human. They go through it really quickly in a queue, so it only takes them 10 seconds or so. So one person can go through a lot of transactions, but we have a human view every transaction. And then we take all of that data for every transaction, including the IMEI off the phone description, a picture of the device from both sides. We put that in a report and we send it to the police, the local police daily, and then we upload it to all these national databases. So as a result, we didn't get a lot of stolen phones because the bad guys were like, there's 1,000 places to sell a phone. But we did get a lot of press that assumed that because we were a robot, we ended up going around training law enforcement in almost every state about how to fight phone. We became phone crime experts. Law enforcement loved us. Your occasional politician wanted to get in the press, didn't. And so we had a lot of PR stuff. My emotional scars haven't healed yet, so that's a different day. And I think you had one, yeah.
And through your experimentation phase, when did you decide, right, I'm on something here? Was it when you saw that line on your first prototype, or was it before or after that? And then,
Sorry, I didn't understand the first part.
yeah, so you went through an experimentation phase where you had your first prototype, right? So was it when exactly did you decide I'm definitely on to something here through that whole prototyping phase, and that I'm going to go really hard at it?
Yeah, my lovely bride's not here. She will tell you that I felt strongly about this idea, and I was pretty sure it would work, but I felt the same feeling about the other $80 million smoking holes in the ground that I left before. So I did, even before this experiment, which is this fine line between being a persevering entrepreneur and being an irresponsible jackass. I think I may have crossed it, but I came home from my 40th VC pitch, and I'm pretty good at separating investors from their money because I'd raised 150 million or so before this for 5 other companies, and so I knew the game, and I thought I could get this funded, and I easily, and I started pitching, and it turns out VCs hate, or most of them, big iron hardware that's retail and consumer, and the response was, hey, wait a second, you're going to build a $50,000 machine that sits and collects junk, and you're going to sell the junk, and that's, it sounds like a bad idea on the surface, but so I came home from Silicon Valley, a roadshow, again, I'd been at this almost a year. So the direct answer to your question is about a year before we got this in the market to test. I couldn't have got there much faster, but I might have even taken, looking back, a step before that, which would be set up a table, if they would let you, in front of a grocery store with a sign that says, I buy phone. You wouldn't learn the same thing, but you would learn some valuable stuff, more than the surveys, right? I skipped that. I could have benefited from that, but we went straight to this machine. But before we got there, we were building her, and we were about to launch, and I went to Silicon Valley, and I came back from 2 or 3 days of meetings and a bunch of VC pitches, and these friends of mine are like, Mark, this is a terrible idea. This is stupid. What are you doing? I'm a friend. This is a dumb idea. This is not VC backable. So I came home, and my wife said, how'd it go? What did they say? They hate it. It was a terrible idea. And I don't know who I'm going to talk to next. But by the way, we need to sell the house, pull the kids out of private school, and sell their college funds, which we did. And again, I crossed that line. But we did this, and a month later, I felt pretty good about it. But it was still another year and a half before I got big checks to write me money, and through all those 20 machines in the field for almost 2 years, because VCs hated this. It's horrible. They wanted to fund all my competitors, Gazelle and people that bought it online. I mean, it sounds smart, right? Just put up a website, everybody will send it to you. And there was a bunch of those guys that got funded hundreds of millions of dollars. And EcoATM just bought the assets of those last few companies The problem there was customer acquisition. They had to spend about $50 to get a phone in the door. So they could only buy really expensive high-end phones, and it narrowed their market, and they didn't do well. So I won and they lost, but it was a hard battle. So, okay.
Well,
Thank you.
you can ask Mark further questions